This season of My Comic Shop History began with the question, what makes a collector? Which we have sought to answer over the past 11 episodes. We offered some practical advice on collecting original art and pops, and we also got at some deeper ideas as we explored how and why people collect. We analyzed the completist mentality many of us struggle with, reflected on our introductions to this hobby and our fandom, and most recently discussed how fatherhood and collecting intersect. Along the way, we took some detours to discuss DC New Frontier, Batman v Superman, self-publishing, comics journalism, and the fate of former alternate realities owner Steve Odo. Now, in our final episode of the season, we try to solve the final piece of the puzzle. Can you go home again? How do you sustain your passion for this hobby? And if you lose it, can you get it back? Can you find a rebirth as a collector? This is the Season 2 finale of My Comic Shop History. Dan, take us away. Welcome to the Season 2 finale of My Comic Shop History. I am your host, Anthony Desiato. We are here once again at Spider's Web in Yonkers on Batman Day, and I am joined by two very special guests across from me at the table here. First, we have Mr. Mike Capolino. Mike, welcome back to the show. The last time you were on the show was Episode 2 of Season 1, and that was the last time I saw you, I think.
It's great to be back. This is a lot of fun. I'm a big fan of you, my man, and all your work. So I'm psyched to be here and have this conversation, share it with everybody.
All right, well, terrific. We're glad to have you. And we also are welcoming a new voice to the show. Even in the final episode, we're bringing in new voices to the show. I'm very excited to welcome Mr. Craig Higgins.
Good to be here. Known Anthony for a while from the shop, from the old alternate reality shop, so it's good to be part of the podcast.
That's right. You two are both former alternate realities regulars who never formally met, but as soon as you both walked into the store today, there was that instant recognition.
Oh, yeah. What was your number?
122.
Oh, 777. Say, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, for a little throwback alternate realities talk, the numbering system was interesting because for a long period, it just like you were assigned a number based on the order in which you signed up. But then it got to a point where people were allowed to just pick their own numbers. We didn't actually have close to 800 regular customers.
No. There's a story behind that, which we may get into at some point. But
actually, yes, that is one of the things that I wanted to mention at the top here. Yeah. So, Craig, when I reached out to you, this was much earlier in the season, and I reached out to you about being a part of Season 2 of the show. And at the time, the idea that I had was to do an episode on unlikely collectors. And I ended up not devoting an entire episode to that. But since you're here, maybe we could explain why you might fall into that category of unlikely collector.
Well, I don't know that that's true, that I'm really that unlikely. But I think the reason people think that is I'm the only guy who probably ever walked into alternate realities wearing a clerical collar. I'm actually a Presbyterian pastor. And people go, what? Ministers read comic books? And there are actually a pretty good number of us who do. And that's where the number comes from, because Steve Odo said, oh, wait, you're a man of the cloth. I'm giving you 666. For those of you who don't know, from your apocalyptic literature and horror movies, that's the mark of the beast in the book of Revelation. And I said, Steve, it's a comic shop. You know somebody's already claimed that number, and someone had. So that's how I ended up at 777.
That's terrific.
Very nice.
Well, your comic shop histories, that's always a question that I ask our guests, and I want to get into that. So, as I mentioned in my little preamble there, sort of the theme of this episode is rebirth. So, over the past few months, I've sort of subjected myself to a little experiment where I had not read or collected comic books on a monthly basis or a weekly basis for quite some time. It had been a few years. And DC announced their Rebirth initiative, where they were relaunching their entire line of books, and the idea and the goal was to sort of reintroduce elements of the characters and the continuity that DC had moved away from the last time they did a relaunch with the New 52. So when they did 52, all of a sudden Superman went from, he was married, one of his parents was alive, and now in the new 52, he and Lois were not together. She didn't know his secret identity. Both of his adoptive parents were dead. It was a bit of a shift, and all of those elements that I just mentioned were aspects of the character I liked a lot, and I think that was a big part of the reason why I wasn't really that interested. And why I was interested when they announced Rebirth and the fact that all of these things were going to be coming back. So I thought to myself, well, it would be interesting because I missed coming to the shop on a Wednesday and getting my books. More than that, I missed being excited for New Comic Book Day. So I thought, let me give this a shot. And that was actually part of the origin of this season. So early on, I thought that maybe the episodes would be more about the Rebirth books and we'd be talking about them, and ended up going in a different direction. But Rebirth was kind of part of the reason why this season came to be, because it made me think about my own collecting habits and my history as a collector. So it's been a few months now. Actually, I think it was mid-April or so, and I came here to Spider's Web, and I sat at this very table, and I filled out my first pull sheet in years. And so over the past few months, I've been coming here every week or every other week and picking up my books. And the results have been, I've talked about this on the show now and then, but the results have been a little bit mixed for me. I don't know that Rebirth has quite reignited my interest to the extent that I hoped it would. And so that's kind of what I want to get at with you guys here today, is to talk about the ebbs and flows in our collecting careers, because as I've experienced myself, and as I've heard from a lot of people over the years at the shop and on the podcast, at conventions, things like that, it can be hard to sustain over such a long period of time. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I want to get into. Before we really dive in, if you'll indulge me, we're at the season finale here, so I just want to take a moment and acknowledge some people who helped make this show happen over this season. So, primarily we've recorded here at Spider's Web in Yonkers, owned and run by Paul Barrero. We've also done some episodes at Aw Yeah Comics in Harrison, run by Mark Hammond. And we also did our Big Pops episode at Undiscovered Realm in Hartsdale, and that was with our good friend Chris Wilcock. So I want to thank all three of those guys for having us and being so supportive of the show. For people who are in the Westchester area, I really encourage them to check out these stores. I'm not just saying that because they've been very good to me. They are great shops.
Yeah, Spider's Web's awesome place. My new shop, great place.
My first time at Spider's Web, but I live 5 minutes from Aw Yeah over in Harrison, and it's a great place. So,
yeah. I mean, listen, I know comic shops. I can't say that about a lot of things, but I know comic shops, and these are some great stores, and I encourage people to check them out. I also want to thank my guardian angel in Australia, Dan Pritchard. Dan did the awesome theme music that you hear at the beginning and end of every episode. He also stepped in and helped me on a technical matter last minute on one of the episodes, and has been a tremendous supporter as well. So thank you to Dan. As always, I must thank my soon-to-be wife, Stephanie. We're recording this 3 weeks from the wedding, and it will air, and it's going to air 3 days before the wedding. So, her support and encouragement is always...
He's sweating profusely right now, everybody.
It's a little warm in here, that's why. No, but I couldn't be more excited, and she's always so supportive and encouraging, and she hears me editing these episodes all hours of the night, so thank you to her. My guests, you guys here and everyone who's been on the show, everybody comes ready to play and with great insight. A lot of people come with notes. You guys didn't. That's okay. That's not a... It's all good.
Mental notes.
Totally.
Yeah. But some people come with notes, and it's just...
I actually went and tracked down what my first comic was, because I always forget the exact number of it, but I know the cover like at the back of my head. So stuff like that.
Nice. But everyone just comes ready to play and with a lot of enthusiasm, and so I really appreciate... the show, there would be no show. So similarly, there would really not be much of a show if nobody was listening to it. So last but certainly not least, I really want to thank everyone who has listened to the show, especially people who listened to the first season and enjoyed the alternate reality saga and stuck with us for this new version of the show. This show underwent a rebirth of sorts as we moved in a different direction. So for everyone who stuck with it, I really appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on collecting. And for people who maybe missed out on the first season and decided to just jump in with this, thank you too, and welcome, and I hope you stick with it. As for the future of the show, we are going to do another Christmas special, so that'll be out sometime in December. And beyond that, there will be a season 3. Don't know exactly when or what it will be. It hasn't fully revealed itself to me yet, but it will, and I'm excited, and I have a couple of ideas. So there will be more My Comic Shop history. All right. Well, thank you guys for indulging me in that. And I guess let's get into this here. So, Mike, when I interviewed you for my comic shop documentary, this was a number of years ago now.
Yeah.
You said
Wow.
something that it stood out to me when you said it in the episode. It made it into the movie. It's in the introductory sequence where everyone's talking about how they got into comics. And it's definitely something that's been in my head as I've been doing these episodes and planning for this finale. So you talked about how you were into comics, then you fell out of it, and then you got back into it again. And you said that when you did, it was like reconnecting with old friends. And I mentioned my Rebirth experiment. I was hoping to have a similar experience, and I found that it was more like acquaintances and not like old friends. I didn't really have that same experience. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what it was like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, to give you a little background, I mean, my separation was a little bit, separation. My time away from comics is a little bit different than yours, because for me it had a lot to do with going to college, and I just I wasn't at my shop. And maybe the year before that, I got heavily into the Grateful Dead and thus music generally, and surfing, and and in the year before that, probably girls. So a lot of things kind of got in the way. I was still collecting comics up until the end of high school, but then when I got to college, it wasn't practical. I didn't have enough money, time, etc. When I got back into comics, it was a slow process. I started working at a bookstore, at the Borders bookstore in White Plains. Many of you may know. It was a great place, definitely at the time. And I had, I graduated from college, and I was kind of between before. I did a year of grad school and working at the store. And there was a new comic store in the Westchester Mall, which had just opened. So I guess it's got to be 1997. And it was much more minimalist than this. It's kind of clearly the end of the comics boom of the 90s, because they could put less product out and expect to make make their money to run a store in the Westchester. I mean, it's a little ridiculous. But the one thing they had was they had the Frank Miller Sin City graphic novels. And they intrigued me. And I remember Frank Miller from Daredevil, and but I don't know if the first time, if you remember when you saw Sin City, it was quite different. It's quite a different, it's all that negative drawing. I mean, essentially, he's not drawing the characters; he's drawing the backgrounds. It's phenomenal. So anyway, then, and our store had a fairly large graphic novel section, and the day after I remember walking in there, I went back and looking for the Sin City in our store to get the discount. I actually found the graphic novel for their collection of Squadron Supreme limited series, Mark Grunwald series from Marvel in the 80s that I'd been a huge fan of. And it was the reprint where just after he died, so it was the reprint that they put his ashes in the ink, which I didn't know about till years later. But I remember I picked it. I was like, oh, I remember this. And I think I was working, and I think I sat down for like 30 minutes reading it. And so that was my first kind of entrance back. And then I wandered into a more serious store in White Plains, which I only think of now as Irene and Bishop's store. I don't even remember the name of it.
Comic Book Heaven.
Comic Book Heaven, thank you. And this was the time of the Marvel, right after Marvel had done all the Image creators, and they had what was Reborn. Heroes Reborn, I think. Oh, yeah. And particularly Kurt Busiek and George Perez on the Avengers. And the Avengers had been my book. West Coast Avengers was my favorite book, and Avengers generally. So I think unlike what you experienced, Anthony, I got lucky. I was first bowled over by an artwork that was in keeping with what I had been studying in college and learning about, as far as what was kind of... I guess I don't want to, avant-garde, the term I would have used then, but, it's like more progressive and using this form that I'd always loved in a way that was completely different than I had experienced it previously. And then I got to pick up on something and got acquainted with an object, an artwork, a story that I'd loved. And then immediately thereafter, I got one of the best versions of my favorite comic dumped, was new and exciting. And everything was being built around that in a certain way. So that's why, for me, it was reacquainting with old friends, because, Busiek was writing those characters the way I remembered them. And in more so, and in fact, better, because it was sophisticated now. And then there was also a bunch of other great works around that period. Transmetropolitan Preacher, Starman, Top 10, Promethea. That was a kind of renaissance of serious literary comics. Understanding comics, I actually read. It was one of the few comics I read in college. So when I got back into comics, I was coming with all these ideas. They weren't getting excited about the characters themselves. It was about kind of literary, philosophical, on some level, ideas that I'd been encountering, that I was jazzed about from college and grad school. And like I said, I was lucky enough that one of the best versions of my favorite comic was being created new and excitingly at that point. So, I was seeing him, I couldn't have described the Hawkeye that I met in those pages as being the friend that I had known when I was younger, prior to meeting him there, because, the Hawkeye that I was a fan of from Avengers West Coast and whatnot wasn't that sophisticated. It was drawn more for younger kids. So that's really where so I got really lucky there, and I got to reacquaint myself with that, and I found a great shop soon after where I felt comfortable walking in and hanging out. I think I was starting to go to alternate realities within about a year or two. By 99, definitely, but I think by 98 I was already going there regularly. And I had, dug through back issues. It was another thing of the right comics, the ones that were still good, reliving them. New Mutants and X-Men and West Coast Avengers, stuff that I still reread to this day and enjoy. And that helped. That was a spark, to push me along. I had both. It was both the excitement, getting back to those friends, but I also had some intellectual engagement was going on. I mean, that was the renaissance of some really serious comics being mass-produced. Yeah. Cerebus was still happening at that point. Y is just a couple years later. Y the Last Man.
One of my all-time favorites.
That's
series.
One of the great. That's the only comic that's ever made me cry. The last issue, is that the last or second to last? When that moment. Yeah. Oh man, I think I dropped the comic.
That could be a whole nother podcast topic of comics that have made you cry. I can think of several. Yeah.
So I hope I haven't gone on too long. I don't want to.
No, not at all. I mean, that was
great. That's
fascinating. Was what I wanted to know, and it's when you bring up the intellectual stimulation, that's something that I wanted to hit on, because I feel like that might be part of the problem that I'm having. I don't mean to put down the current Rebirth books or the current superhero comics generally, but I think that's definitely part of it for me, that I'm not being stimulated in that way, the way you were with those other books, and the way that I've been with other books in the past. Yeah. So I think that's definitely an aspect of it. You mentioned the shop as well, kind of tying both seasons of the podcast together. I mean, I think that's a factor as well.
You can't discount how you could go there not thinking about having a long conversation or at any level, and then an hour and a half later you're still talking about comics, and you're talking about them on both a fanboy level but a satisfying one. Like I think about was that Zach's rant from the first movie about Cap, the most phenomenal fanboy rant ever, but it was so spot on, like as far as like what he talks about. So like you could get that. It was good times. The shop is definitely a part of it.
But I want to turn now to Craig and get a little bit of sense of your comic shop history. I mean, I guess most recently when we were discussing it in preparation of this episode, you mentioned how you've mostly gone digital these days.
Well, at least I was trying for a while. After the alternate reality shop closed, I decided we didn't know that Oh Yeah was coming to Harrison. I didn't have a so without a store and a pull sheet, what do? I think everybody listening to this podcast knows about pull sheets, right? Where people will hold comics for you. And plus, my wife of 32 years, we're recording this on her birthday, so I'll be going to join her and our daughter in Brooklyn in a little while. But
thank you for making time for us today.
Hey, she's in Brooklyn already, so that works out well. I know she would be perfectly happy if there were a few less boxes of books around. And I kind of joke, when people call me a collector, I go, that really sounds much fancier than what I am. I don't know that I collect comics. I really just read them. I mean, I do have boxes of them in my basement, but I really just read. So what I've discovered, found a great. We spent most of the summer up near Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire. I was on a pastoral sabbatical, which our church does every 5 to 7 years, and found a great shop up there, and realized that what I miss is being able to go into a shop and talk to people about comic books and actually say, so what's good, and get recommendations. So I don't know if I'm really making the switch to the digital world or not. And now with and discovering this place, it's the conversations. I actually kind of enjoy reading comic books on an iPad. Is nice. The art kind of pops in a lot of ways. It's a good medium, but it is more of a social experience buying comics. And so I don't know that I'm going to fully make that switch. And over the summer, listen, my backpack's got a Jetpack Comics from Rochester, New Hampshire button on the back now. It was only in there a couple of times, but it was nice to get some recommendations. So for me, recently getting back into buying comics, I just started picking up Batman on Rebirth. I'm told that the detective is even better, but I need to pick up some of these. What you were saying, Mike, about the intellectual stimulation, though, is true. That's what the New 52 just lost me on that, and I almost quit reading DC entirely during the New 52. So,
I mean, I am a Marvel zombie, as probably Wiley remembers. And that's where the collector in me comes, is that I just have this, and it feeds a little bit. I'm a little bit OCD, and this kind of scratches that itch just enough that it doesn't come out in a lot of other ways. I mean, it's not so great. I spent quite a bit more than I should, but it allows me to scratch an itch. I probably would have some other outlets that aren't as positive.
I mean, I read comics now. I buy graphic novels. I read stuff through Comixology or something like that. Where as a kid, a pull sheet would have been a dream come true. I mean, I bought comics going to one particular pharmacy and one particular sort of gas station, grocery store, and I knew a few places. I knew there was this one little convenience store between where my parents lived and where my great aunt, whose name was Iowa, looked like Iowa, but this is Georgia. It was called Iowa, where they lived, that always had good books. You would miss comics and then find it crammed in the back of a turn rack, later. Boy, it would have been a dream come true when I was a kid. I should say I'm probably older than both of you guys. I'm 55, and so I started reading comics literally when the Batman TV show was about to start in 1966. Anthony's probably heard this story. My earliest childhood memory is Christmas Eve of 1965. I was 4 years old, and my Uncle Warren said to my dad, whose name was Royce, "So, Royce, did you hear they're doing a Batman comic book?" I said, "Who's Batman?" And my uncle went back to he was probably 18, something, still living at home, went back to his bedroom, brought out a stack of comic books and handed them to me. And, created a monster, my wife would say.
Yeah.
Now, that's a fantastic first memory.
That's a great story.
Yeah, it's a good first memory. It literally, well, at least it's the first memory I can date clearly.
It's a great comic fan origin story too, man. That's a good one. It's a very good one.
Yeah, Christmas
there you go.
I mean,
it was Christmas
so
Eve.
rich, so rich.
For years, I actually thought that memory must have been wrong, because how could it be
like
Christmas
you crammed
Eve?
a few together or something.
And Wikipedia solved the problem. I realized I had forgotten that Batman was a winter replacement show. It did not premiere in September. It premiered in January of 1966. So my memory was right. It really was Christmas Eve.
So during those early years of reading and collecting, you said you were mainly at pharmacies and grocery stores. Do you remember the first true comic shop that you encountered?
Oh gosh, yeah. Because see, there were no comic shops. At least there were certainly no comic shops in Northeast Georgia, where I grew up. When I was a kid at all. I became an avid reader all through my childhood, mostly DC, although early Fantastic Four was amazing. Read a lot of the Avengers, but I was a Batman guy, and I became one of those Batman guys who loved the TV show, loved the comics, and then when I was 9 years old and the TV shows had gone off, of course they made the turn where Dick's going off to college and Bruce is moving into the city, and suddenly he was the Batman, which I just hyped up my love in a whole nother level. If you've not read Glenn Weldon's history of Batman that just came out within the last year or so, it's amazing. And I started listening to the Pop Culture Happy Hour podcast largely because I read Glenn Weldon's book. And so I was one of those who just loved that turn. Then in late high school, most of my college years just wasn't reading at all. Comic books were off my radar. But the laundry that I dropped my clothes off at when I was probably senior year of college, a comic shop had opened next door. And I would go in every now and then and buy something. My wife says she didn't know that. We started dating when I was a senior in college, and she swears she didn't know about that. And that when we married, she had no idea about this comic book thing. By the way, she approves it. One of the things my wife often says, particularly to people in the church who are like, wait, your husband reads comic books? She goes, do you know how many smart people read comic books? So hey.
That's right.
There you go. But that comic shop opened, bought a few things here or there, and then in the mid-'80s, we were living in Macon, Georgia. I was working at a church there, and another really good comic shop opened. And this would have been in, 84, 85. And, of course, that was when all things X-Men were just exploding. And so I remember going there, buying all the X-Men titles, buying all of these back issues of X-Men titles, buying the original Complete Guide to the Marvel Universe that came out as a actual periodical, getting caught up on all those things. And so then by the time we moved to Philadelphia in 1986 and started grad school, immediately found a comic shop north of our house. This is, of course, when, in those years was The Dark Knight, Batman Year One,
Watchmen.
Still one of my absolute, I never knew about Watchmen until my son was reading it a few years ago. I completely missed Watchmen somehow. But Batman Year One became one of my favorite titles ever. And then where it became more serious was in 1989, I was starting a chapter of a campus ministry called RUF at Georgia Southern University, which is down near Savannah in Statesboro, Georgia, for all the Allman Brothers fans who are listening here. And no kidding, there was a shop there that was a pawn shop and comic book store, pawn, gun, and comics. And a guy who was then a kid he was maybe 20 or so at the time, named Ted Gallup, opened up a comic book shop in his dad's pawn shop and gun shop. And Ted knew the comic book world backwards and forwards. And so I'm hoping that shop is still there. If anybody who knows about it is listening, love for you to let us know. A shout out to Ted Gallup. He is who got me into the whole comic shop world in a hardcore way with a unpaved parking lot in Statesboro, Georgia.
So it seems like each of you had this, it seems like one significant period where you fell out of it and then you got back into comics. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. There have been a few for me. There was that period and actually when we moved to New York in 1994, for the first few years, I didn't have a comic book shop, very, very busy. Our church is a new church development. So I came here as a what we call a church planter. You're gonna take 6 couples and build a church out of this. So it wasn't a lot of free time. We had little kids. My youngest daughter was born the summer we launched the new church. Poor thing. So it was really, so there was a period there in the late 90s when there was this wonderful, there was this creative genius, and then Marvel's collapsing, and I really wasn't reading comics. It was, maybe I was at Alternate Realities a little earlier than I said. I remember somebody told me about Ed Brubaker's run on Captain America. And That was just world changing for me. I'd never been a Captain America fan. I'd always thought Cap was kind of a cheesy character. I liked it how every now and then somebody would try to make him stand up against the system and all of this. But as a kid, Captain America was kind of dull. Quicksilver was interesting.
I grew up with the Mark Grunwald Captain America.
Well, see,
so,
and that's
man,
just
he
a
was,
very
he was
different.
Cool.
I have since gone back and read those, but I missed that, and so Ed Brubaker brought me back in, and then the Marvel Ultimate Universe was starting up, and I remember looking for a comic shop because I wanted to read this Ultimate Fantastic Four series, which would have been, 05, something like that. And
somewhere around there.
That's when I discovered, I literally was driving down Central Park Avenue in Scarsdale to find a different shop, and I saw the sign for Alternate Realities.
Oh, you found the better one.
And went in and went,
let
me try these guys. Yeah, I don't remember what the other store was even called, and that's okay. But I remember, here's this, this really snarky guy named Steve who ran the shop, and I went, I'm in. I like this place, and they know what they're doing. My favorite Steve. This is off topic,
That's
but my
fine.
my favorite Steve Odo memory was the whole Death of Captain America arc. And I was in there on. I didn't often come in on Wednesdays. I would try to come in on Thursday or Friday when it wasn't as busy, and. But I was in there on New Comic Day, and Steve is literally just handing these out from behind the counter and going, you're not sending your kid to college with this, right? And it was like this mantra, this litany, you're not sending your kid to college. And then the next customer, you're not sending.
What was this thing? Crushing Dreams Daily or something?
That's right.
And
Shattering Dreams.
I like this guy, so.
Yeah, I feel I'd have to check, but I feel like that story came up in the first season, so clearly that really made an impression. The fact that this is the whole thing with the Death
very
of Captain
first
America.
episode of this podcast. There was a similar story. I don't know if it was Death of Captain America specifically, but it came up. Yeah.
So for each of you, you've experienced at least one, and Greg, in your case, multiple rebirths as collectors, and it seems like. Timing is really important, right? Being at a place in your life, because again, you're falling out of it, when you go to high school or college or whatever, and I think that's natural as your kind of priorities shift and you're focusing on different things, but, so the right time in your life, the right shop, the right storyline. I mean, so it seems like timing is a really big piece of all of this.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I had all three come together, really, you might say. Yeah, so you're absolutely right with that.
Yeah. I mean, in reflecting on, my own history with this, I've talked many times about how I got into comics with Death of Superman, but I think my golden age of reading and collecting was probably early to mid 2000s. And that's when I was in high school and starting to work at Alternate Realities. And there were a number of runs at that time that I enjoyed so much and that I think still hold up today. So this was when you had, Jeff Johns was just getting started. He had his Flash run, and then he moved over, brought back the JSA. And then obviously Hawkman and Green Lantern, Teen Titans, those would follow. But initially, his Flash and JSA runs. Jeff Loeb and Joe Kelly took over the Superman books after a period that wasn't the best. And, they really turned things around. Greg Rucka and Ed Brubaker on the Batman books.
Oh, yeah. Gotham Central.
One of my all-time favorites. Rucka was also doing Wonder Woman. You had Green Arrow. Kevin Smith brought him back, and then Brad Meltzer had a terrific arc after that. Grant Morrison, this was a little bit earlier, but Morrison, and then later Mark Waid on JLA. So there were just all of these books, and I think just the timing of it, working at the store and being around this stuff all the time and reading the books that I was enjoying. I was making money working at the store. I was buying my books. I was there on Wednesdays, over the summers, and I was getting the books first. I think it was just the perfect storm in a great way of all of these things.
You're definitely one to hear, and you're never gonna experience that Wednesday. That excitement from that period. That's definitely one thing that has not carried over, where I can't wait to get home to crack open my bag and there's 5 issues that I have to read right away. That didn't carry over. I mean, there was things I wanted to read right away, but I could, I didn't. And you being there for that period and also being able to you're kind of reviving on everybody else's juices from that. That don't look to find again because you're not. I mean,
I think that was
that's the hard one. Yeah,
one of my mistakes. I think going back to Steve Odo and his Odoisms, he's a big proponent of keeping your expectations low.
Yeah,
and I think, in fairness to DC and Rebirth, I think I pinned too much on Rebirth. And I will say this though: that first Wednesday, man, was I excited! I left work during lunch, drove down here, I got it. I may have read Rebirth in my office in the afternoon. Probably shouldn't say that, but they don't. But they don't listen to
that
this.
That can be edited out in post-production.
I don't think they even know what I do. So that I do a podcast. I think it's okay. And I was super excited that day. And it was great reading Rebirth. I enjoyed that Rebirth special a lot. Talking about comic books that maybe make you tear up.
Yeah.
When Wally is saying goodbye to Barry, and it seems like that's going to be it. I mean, it got me.
Yeah.
It really got me. And so I enjoyed it, and I was intrigued. The whole, I guess mild spoilers. I think most people are aware of this at this point. The whole Watchmen reveal didn't really do much for me. I mean, I'm not opposed to it, but I wasn't necessarily jazzed by that prospect. Yeah. It just sort of was. I was more excited to have Wally back. Like, that was really cool. That was, in terms of those aspects that DC lost, I was really happy to see him back. And then over the the weeks and months that followed, I would come here to get my stuff, and I didn't, and I still have not achieved that level of excitement. But as you're saying, and I agree, I think it's maybe unfair to expect that.
Yeah, there are sentimental connections that we have. I mean, there are so many reasons. You talk about storylines and timing and stations in life, but there are sentimental connections that we have with characters. So for me, bringing Wally West back is a big deal, partly because I was reading the Teen Titans in the 60s. I'm one of those who experienced the whole 70s, where the Titans, very much like the Green Lantern, Green Arrow run, where the Titans gave up their powers and their costumes and run around working for social good. Come on, as a little kid, we'd be running around in the backyard of our friends' houses playing superheroes, and Kid Flash was one of the characters I liked to play. The first time I ever remember crying at a comic book was when Johnny Storm and Crystal the Inhuman broke up. It's one of those moments where I can still remember
I was romantic.
I was in the 6th grade, and we were going to Disney World over the Christmas vacation in a piggyback camper. If you're old enough to remember those, the campers that sat in the back of a pickup truck and all of that. That's what we had. And so the first night, we were going to Disney World the next day, and we were camping in Ocala, Florida, when that was a little small town, and we had stopped to buy gas. I noticed they had comic books, and there was the new Fantastic Four, and it's the one where Crystal tells Johnny she's leaving him for Pietro, the Quicksilver. And literally, it made me cry. It was like, oh my gosh, this is so sad. And so that's it. We have these sentimental connections with characters that we loved. So finding that first joy of, what happened to these people? Yeah, for me, it's about stories. It really is. And there are some good storytellers out there in the comic book world. And that's why when you pick up a storyline that doesn't tell the story that way, it's painful. Right. For me, New 52, the first one I read, and it kind of poisoned me for everything, was JLA, and I enjoyed the art. It was Jim Lee, right, who did the art for that. Yep. Where we're sitting, we're looking at the Hush poster, kind of on the back wall of Spider's Web here, and which was a storyline I loved, and I enjoyed his take on the art. I know not everyone does, but I did. And I was sort of excited about JLA, and to see how they had kind of dumbed down Hal Jordan to this kind of impetuous character. I'm sorry, I went, no, that's not the Hal Jordan I know and love. Yeah. So.
Now you bring up both of you bring up a number of excellent points. Part of the reason I wanted Craig here, I feel like I need a little bit of spiritual counseling because I suppose
sorry, I'm off today. So no.
Are you still on sabbatical? Yeah. I'll check back in a couple of weeks.
I'm not wearing a collar, by the way. No, you're never off duty in this job. So, yeah.
No, I mean, I suppose I've been wrestling with a bit of nostalgia, and I don't know exactly why. I mean, certainly entering a new phase of life, so I suppose maybe that's what's made me look back a little bit. My parents sold their childhood home a couple of years ago, and then the year later, alternate realities closed. So there were like these
that's hard.
two big major things.
Yeah,
and I think it probably is both of those things that have made me sort of look back a little bit, and with that wistfulness, maybe not even so much for, maybe just more so for the time than for the stories themselves. But it's funny when you mention
those are so tied together. I mean, how would you even separate whether it's the time or the stories? I mean, your reaction to those first stories. One of the great thing about this medium, the greatest thing about this medium, is that it's both simple and complex.
Yeah, exactly.
It's incredibly simple. Obviously, the whole point of it is to literalize language and have language to accompany that. So it's made, but at the same time, the great ones are sophisticated. So I'm trying to get back on track here. Sorry about that, but
no worries. But you mentioned while you think of it, you mentioned the great ones, and this was something that came up in the Complete Run episode that I did with Dan Greenfield earlier in the season, and this was helpful to me too, because I guess it was something that I didn't really think about all that much, but. These great stories that we always hold up as the classics. I mean, for me, something like New Frontier, for example, we did a whole episode on that. One of my all-time favorites. Gotham Central, Why the Last Man. These are not the norm as far as comics and certainly as far as superhero comics go. I mean, these are the exceptions.
Well, that's the good. I mean, that's good because then they wouldn't be all that special and great.
True. Yes.
I mean, that's one of the the downsides of a Renaissance is that good stuff is not so good compared to the great stuff. But it's difficult to extricate those the feelings about great stories from the first time you encountered them, particularly with comics, because of that duality. Because I think because I think that it you definitely you can blow through a comic. I mean, we've all read comics in a minute, right? I mean, a full 22-page, right?
I was going to ask you guys, because in reading these Rebirth books, I mean, I swear, it's like under 5 minutes.
Especially the nowadays the big panels, everything is to highlight, not necessarily, and the artists are not storytellers; they're portraitists, if you will. It's a big difference from when we were getting into comics, when they were storytellers.
Well said.
But it's difficult because you hear you encounter these stories and you encounter them simply, but there's more going on, and you are actually encountering that as well. I mean, as a reader, even if you're not a sophisticated enough reader to be aware of all of the levels of any given narrative, any given comic of what's going on, you actually are consuming it. It's taking in, so that the next time you come to it, maybe with that, it'll be more apparent. Even if you're not schooled in in techniques to uncover that sophistication, or not to uncover, but to recognize the sophistication.
Right.
So you get these powerful reactions because you're young, and you're excited on a visceral level, from the art, there's titillation on some level. I mean, certainly that's not to be ignored. And that on that pre-acknowledgement of titillation, where it's just excitement, but at the same time, with the great ones or with the ones that you come back to, there's a sophistication going on of a narrative, and it's getting ingrained in you, and it's getting in there. So actually, that was one of the big things that because I went to college and graduate school. I studied literature and philosophy from a critical angle, from historical, but from a critical angle, certainly in grad school. So these were all things that when I got back into comics, I started to be able to reflect on. I had the tools, the techniques.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was powerful. Because I had not, because I could recognize that I liked them on one level, and now there was this second level that I could appreciate them. Gaining that appreciation was huge to keeping the fires going for me. Yep. Seeing them as part and parcel of the intellectual, the art I was getting excited about. Being able to reflect on that, and that helped a lot.
It's a great medium. If you want to be intellectually challenged, or you're just simply looking for something to read for fun at night, comics are great for that.
Phenomenal.
And there's something for every taste. There's something for every level. There's something for every age group. And so for me, it's been the reason I keep coming back, the reason there have been these constant rebirths.
No, I mean, you guys bring up some really important points about comics as a medium and as an art form. And it's funny, I've been talking about my Rebirth experiment, I suppose, as somewhat of a failure, but one key area where it has succeeded, and I am happy about this, is, not only was I not reading comic books every week, but I also wasn't really delving into my library or checking out other books either. I mean, I had pretty much stopped. And while I haven't loved all the Rebirth stuff, it has just gotten me in the habit and the mindset of reading comics and being interested in comics again. And so I finally, it took years, but I finally started reading the Mark Waid run on Flash. Which when I was studying for the bar exam a few years ago, I made a number of impulse buys, and that was one of them. I bought the complete run on eBay, and it just sat in a box for the past few years. I had read the end part of his run a few years ago when I was really at the height of my collecting. Actually, the way I got into Flash was at Comic Book Heaven. I remember I was there one Wednesday, New Comic Book Day. They had all the new books out, and it was Flash 152. It was the first issue of the Dark Flash Walter West saga. And it just caught my eye, and I picked it up. And so I read the tail end of Waid's run, and I had gone back and read a little, like the year or two prior to that. But for the first time, I really sat down, and I started with Born to Run. And I don't know if either of you have read that particular story or any of his run, but
remember that one.
I enjoyed it a lot. There was, I guess if I had to boil it down to one thing, it was an element of heart that I haven't really found in much of what I'm currently reading. And I enjoyed it a lot. And I'm coming right at the next thing that I have to read. This I actually have read previously, but not in a very long time. But The Return of Barry Allen, which I have very fond memories of, and I can't wait to revisit.
That's going to really hit you probably.
Now in the
one.
context of his entire run. Yeah, I mean, whereas previously I had just picked up the trade and I read it in a vacuum, to now read it as part of the run. So I'm excited about that, and I think, maybe that's how I need to think about this, because expecting to be as excited about New Comic Book Day as I once was, I don't really think that's realistic with what's coming out and where I am in my life at this point.
Different stage of life.
Right. I think that maybe is the rebirth. I'm looking for a rebirth in a different way.
Highly encourage that. I mean, the unspoken, the part I didn't mention about my return to comics was that I went and bought, I went through a lot of back issues, and I reread a lot of what I loved, getting back into the stories. So so that definitely helped us. I talked about meeting again the Squadron Supreme, but I reread my entire run of like West Coast Avengers to get up to, the issue that I had to buy as a back issue again, because God forbid I didn't remember the entire 60 plus issues that came before it. But that was the jazz, and then I could smooth over the other parts. I would definitely, that's do that. Rereading the past, going through the stuff, even just flipping. I don't know if you do the flip method of read sometimes. If you don't have time or something, if you grab I did the flip. I bought on eBay, not recently. This is like 3 or 4 years ago now. But a run of Micronauts, which had been one of my favorite comics but it will never be collected again, and I had never had a chance to revisit it. I read like 30 issues in one night because I could remember the story like, oh God, oh my God. And that really was great. That helped. I eventually wound up rereading them again, not all 30 yet, but I've been rereading them more closely, but that helped, man. It just, and then next time I wanted to go to the store to see what was there.
There are certain things that I do go back and reread too. There, it will always whet my appetite for seeing what else is new.
Yeah.
From the '60s, it's the Steranko run on Nick Fury, Director of S.H.I.E.L.D., Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., whatever it's called. I just still remember the first one of those books I ever bought at a pharmacy or something like that was
so jealous.
I've never been able to sit down in a barber chair since, because there was a secret one of the secret S.H.I.E.L.D. locations was underneath the barber shop, and the chair drops you down. But then you turn the page and suddenly it's all this psychedelic art, and as a kid going, what is this? But I go back, I have that as a graphic novel now, and so that whole run. There's one Detective Comics issue that I own. It's never been republished in any of the collections that I'm aware of. From early to mid 70s. One of the first, Batman's out in the night kind of things called Night of the Stalker, where there's not a single word of dialogue coming from the Batman's mouth at all. He never says a word, but it starts with a bank robbery where a child is orphaned, and the whole arc is him chasing down criminals until the end. Just as the sun is coming up, he finds the last member of the crew, and that member of the crew was just a kid. And there's a scene of Batman holding the guy by the collar, about to punch him, and the kid just dissolves into tears, and he drops him and runs. And the very last episode is he's in the Wayne Foundation penthouse with his cowl removed, looking at a picture of Thomas and Martha Wayne. And it talks about how, he flashes back to another sobbing boy on a street, and for this moment, he is that boy again. And it's just one of those comics I remember reading as a middle schooler, tearing up, thinking this is powerful. So there are certain ones you just go back and reread, and that'll drive me into a store and go, I got to get some more comics.
That's definitely the way to do it.
Yeah. There's some magic to this hobby, and it's something that you can't force, as I've learned with this, because I can go through the motions of filling out a pull sheet and driving to the store and grabbing my books and chatting with people here and going home and sitting there and reading, but I can't force that excitement,
right?
And I can't make myself be excited about it if I'm not. Like, I think about the examples I always come to during my high school days. When the final issues of Batman Hush, which Craig you mentioned before, and Identity Crisis came out, I remember driving to alternate realities during my lunch period. As seniors, we were allowed to leave. My school, I went all boys Catholic school. They were very strict, but as seniors, you were allowed to leave campus during lunch. And I remember driving to alternate realities, and this was a couple of years before I would get a key. So I dared to knock on the door before the store was open. I was working there, but I didn't have a key.
Right.
And Steve let me in. He wasn't thrilled, I could tell, but he let me in. And I picked up, on each of those occasions, I picked up the issues. And I remember sitting in my car. I used to park off to the side. That was my spot at alternate realities, off to the side. And sitting there reading that final issue of Hush and that final issue of Identity Crisis. I remember sitting there reading it more than I remember the story itself.
Right.
But so that's, I guess, what I've sort of been trying to recapture. And over the course of our conversation, I mean, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And I think that what my goal now is to be able to look back and be happy that I had that experience and that I had that excitement and not be sad that I'm not feeling that now.
Right.
That's trying to cure myself of nostalgia, basically.
Well, you're in a lucky period. I mean, a lot of stuff has been print now that has never been in print or hasn't been in print for decades. That's great in this medium.
I just wanted to mention, though, this idea of trying to recapture that excitement. We've spoken a lot over the season about pops, and that's something that I am excited about, and I'm excited about collecting, and it's organic. It's not something that I'm trying to force. Like Undiscovered Realm, they just posted photos. The new Power Rangers ones and Legends of Tomorrow pops came in, and it's like, I'll be there tomorrow to pick them up, and I'm excited about that. And
I'm psyched to pre-order the Scooby-Doo pops.
I saw those, right?
Oh my God, I'm so stoked for them.
Yeah. But so,
I'm not into them at all.
Good.
And it's
You're
like,
lucky.
it's a slippery slope.
It really is. It's terrible. I started with Fallout ones because I collect I'm a huge fan of the game Fallout, and they're associated. And we used to be so little merch, so I got those, and then
But so what I was going to ask, as far as the ritual, and I think I have a sense, at least of Craig's answer, because you mentioned about how you don't even necessarily consider yourself a collector. But just in general, that ritual of coming to get your books and collecting to whatever extent you do, how much are those forces driving you versus you're a fan, you're a reader?
Right. Well, I talked about earlier how this feeds a little bit of my, kind of, it rubs the OCD itch for me, scratches it just enough. So definitely that's part of it. Is I like that I have that once a week that I go Wednesday, Thursday. I've come back to Wednesdays here. I was Thursday strong.
I know
years.
You were Thursday at Alternate Realities.
Yeah.
I'd see you in there.
I moved back to Thursday here. The traffic's a little bit easier on Wednesday than Thursday. So, so on some level it does. It's the ritual of it. I'm big on. I mean, I think rituals are important in human life generally. Even something as silly, if you will, as going to a comic shop on a weekly basis or a bi-weekly basis, whatever the ritual may be, monthly, to feed that Jones. But so I think that's important. I don't think it's the be-all, end-all. If I felt like I was able to get as much enjoyment from just buying graphic novels on eBay or on Amazon, because almost everything now is collected, virtually everything.
Yes.
And I mean, that's, I love the image books, and that's, those are my favorites. Well, you can't sample. It's harder. It's more expensive and harder. It's the way to sample a graphic novel. So there's that. I'd kind of cut myself off from some of that. But I think I would drop a lot more, and I'd be reading old stuff. That's really all I'd be reading is, I'd probably stick up and keep getting. I love the omnibus format. I love especially when they add ancillary issues. I mean, I'm such a freaking Marvel zombie dork, but in the best way possible. But I don't know that I think I wouldn't be into as much. But it's not only coming, which I think is what you were somewhat. Is it a driving force?
Right.
No, but it's definitely a satisfying and comforting regular activity that would keep me going. Would have kept me going at alternate realities, maybe on some level more.
I think about that. I mean, we're sitting here in Spider's Web.
Not to diss these guys.
Yeah, it's like we love Spider's Web. And I mean, honestly, everyone here is great. I've mentioned this in the Return of Steve episode. All these other stores that I've been going to, they're fantastic, and we couldn't. The owners could not have been more welcoming. But it's just, again, it's not my comic shop, right?
Right.
So part of me wonders. I still feel like I would have the same reactions to the books regardless of where I'm buying them, but part of me does wonder, like, would my Rebirth experience have been different had I been going to alternate realities instead? I don't know.
Yes, I think it. I mean, I'm going to jump out and say I think it would have. I think you would have been. You used to come and hang out at the store. I mean, like, I would go in. I mean, I'm sure you saw. Would go in. Steve Ryan would be working, but Ant's there. When you were in school, when you were making the doc, or not even, not just you. Sean on his off days, I know I saw him in there. Drew, I mean, how many times I've been there when guys have stopped by the place. I've stopped by when it was like, hey, I went to get Epstein's. Yeah, I thought I'd swing by and see what's going on. The clubhouse effect, and there's nothing against certainly against here, because I've seen that they have their own kind of clubhouse.
Yeah, for sure.
I've seen that. But it was our clubhouse.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. And I think I bought a lot of books. I bought books that I wasn't enjoying out of a sense of loyalty. Yeah. I quit buying. Although now this is the only thing on New 52. Yeah, I didn't enjoy it, and I kind of got the impression that Steve wasn't enjoying it either, and there was a clubhouse effect of not enjoying it together. I'm not going to keep reading this, and everybody else sort of supporting you with that. Right. I might have stuck with it longer if I'd been buying those on Comixology or something.
Yeah, it's like if you came in and Steve was like, "Oh, you got to read this," and we're all like, "Yeah, it's fantastic."
That's it.
It's different.
But I to some extent the story is the story. But I mean, as we've been saying, you associate stories with certain periods in your life. I don't think Johnny Storm breaking up with Crystal would make me cry today like it did when I was 11. And so the same thing is, you associate where you buy a comic with the people you were with when you bought it and what the community was like, and of course that's a part of it.
This idea of going home again, I mentioned that at the top of the show, and it's something that's come up on the podcast before, more specifically last season, when I spoke to Brandon Montclair. He's one of the former owners of Alternate Realities. He went on to be an assistant editor at DC. He's written on a freelance basis.
Rocket Girl's great.
For DC and Marvel, and he's the writer and co-creator of Rocket Girl. And, when we spoke, the store was, the closing was a little ways away, and I asked him if he would stop by to say goodbye to the store, and he was kind of non-committal, but seemed to express an openness towards going back. But
not a sentimental cat, that guy.
No, and he did sort of express that idea of, and in the documentary specifically, of, you can't go home again. And unless he visited in secret, he did not come back to see the store.
Wow.
I mean, despite all the time he spent there and despite owning it. And I don't say that as a criticism, but it's interesting. And so I sort of, that's something I've been wrestling with myself as a collector, as a reader.
Yeah.
Can I go back to that? In the Steve episode, I told the story of a dream that I had that AR was open again.
Yeah.
And in the episode, I said to Steve, I was like, it made me feel like maybe, one day the store could come back. Like, potentially I could bring the store back.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think it wouldn't be the same. Would I have a similar experience with that as I am with this, where it's like it could be the same name, it could even be the same location. It's still open, it's still vacant.
Yeah.
But would it be alternate realities? So this idea of going home again, it has certainly been on my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like because alternate realities. There was the real one, and then there's the one we've all constructed
Right.
that are our own. Memory of that. Yeah. Can you cross the same river twice? I think that's an old. I think that's that's a variant on an old Chinese proverb. Is that you can't, or I think it's actually the statement is that the Yangtze does not flow the same way every day, or something like that. The idea being that time. I mean, you change,
Right.
So no, I guess that's maybe it. And I think I don't want to. I mean, I don't think you have been unrealistically looking for that excitement. Sorry about that. But maybe you do need to temper it down and look for other pleasures from the experience and the ritual. Maybe you do work it out where it's every other week, so that you're not rushing, so that that you kind of make time for it,
Right.
and you kind of can enjoy some of the pleasures that are extra comics.
But, that points to something that I did want to ask you guys, and it's something that, Mike, we've spoken about this before. It probably is unfair to expect, whether I'm reading the new books or even going back and revisiting some of the, those runs that I mentioned. I mean, like I said, I do think they would hold up pretty well, but at the same time, something that I read when I was 14, how likely is it that I would enjoy it the same way? Is it fair to expect to enjoy it the same way at almost 30?
You might enjoy it as much, but it will be different.
Right.
To wax slightly theological, C.S. Lewis, who, of course, known to a lot of comic book people because a lot of us read fantasy and know The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yep.
Lewis often said that he said, theologically, we never want to say that there's any prayer that God cannot answer. But he said, but probably the best candidate for that category would be the prayer encore. And that is a theme that gets picked up in the Narnia series, where we have Aslan, the great lion, saying, I only tell you your own story. And that sort of idea of your story is your story. You can't recapitulate it. You can't necessarily expect someone else to experience it in exactly the same way. And that's where, you can still go back and revisit this stuff. Sentimentality is underrated, in my opinion. I do get tired of how sentimental a lot of our pop culture is in very manipulative ways for advertising. But on the other hand, nostalgia is not a bad thing. But no, and that's why I can go back and read Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. with Steranko in the day, and I experience it at a completely new level now, but not exactly the same.
Yeah, I think the main thing is to keep your eyes, ears, mind open to what you're gonna come to, so that it can hit you that other way, so that you can have that new experience of it. I think that's
right.
very key. I don't. To want, it's like to want that high again, if you will, that excitement is not a bad thing. But I think that you then can, when you stop hunting it, you start finding it, because then you find new, because then it gets, it's, I don't want to, replaced may not be the correct term, but it's substituted with a newer enjoyment of it. I still, read every few years that Squadron Supreme, man, and I still find that something else. And even though I could probably, there's parts of it that I can close my eyes and I'm reading the dialogue, but I'm not expecting that same sting. I'm actually asking it surprise me again.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And you can't always. Not everything can surprise you again. And maybe that's the surprise. Maybe, in the end, that's a surprise. You don't always get the answer to that you think you're going to get when you get your answer.
That's right.
From
exactly
on
right.
high. So.
Yeah, and something I think about is, in a lot of ways, the documentaries and this podcast, I think that has been my rebirth.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good thing.
This is your comic high in a way,
Mm-hmm.
It is. I'm more interested in talking about comic shops and comics and collecting than I am about necessarily doing those things.
Right.
There's always been. I don't think
Strange.
there's ever been a time in my life when there hasn't been something I'm looking forward to that is related at least to that whole world of comic books. Even in the periods when I wasn't really reading comics. Again, it's this world that has given me I've been reading comic books for 50 years. Off and on, but more on than off for those 50 years. And it's given me a sense of joy. Here's something to look forward to.
Yeah. Well, this conversation has helped me come to terms with my collecting and my current efforts with Rebirth. On a practical level now, though, I have to ask for your advice, for both of you, because I've been considering telling Paul to, I was considering giving him an end point, like stop pulling for me next month or the month after at the end of the year. And I'm kind of leaning towards that. I don't know that continuing on this path is necessarily what I need or want right now. What do you guys recommend?
I think you've already made your choice, dude. That's what
I
it
think
sounds
so
to
too.
me.
This is happening real time here, listeners. We're trying to decide something.
So I wouldn't want to dissuade. I mean, I still think it's a great hobby. Obviously, part of it.
Oh yeah,
enlightened self-interest. My weekly fix. I can't.
And don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that would mean I'm giving up on comics.
No, yeah.
I will always enjoy and appreciate and value comic books as a medium. I don't think I would ever say, I'm done with comics. But I just think, my time and my money would be channeled elsewhere.
Yeah.
That makes sense. The one thing is you could follow comics now without reading comics because there's so much press and there's so much information available.
Yes, that came up. Yeah, I don't mean to cut you off, but that came up when we did the Complete Run episode because, we were talking about, it's okay to drop a title. You don't feel like you need to keep reading it because you might miss out on a piece of the character's adventure. It's like, you probably could just piece it together on your own from the context of the issue. But if not, there are all of these places you can go and you can read a recap and you know what happened.
Yeah. And I mean, everything written nowadays, you really aren't missing. You can't, there's a lot not to, that you won't be missing anything. So
I have to say for me, since Alternate Realities closed last summer, I've not had a pull sheet anywhere. And again, the first time I've been in here, won't be the last. But I live on the other side of the county, so this is not. As a matter of fact, it took me. I used to, if I needed to go to Alternate Realities, it was basically a half-hour drive from my office and a half-hour back. So I haven't had a pull sheet in a long time. Here's what I'm saying. It's been a fun year. What's been fun about it is I do occasionally drift in to over in Harrison, or this summer I would go in. I went into one comic shop in Old Orchard Beach, Maine. I went into a comic shop in Rochester. I looked for one up in North Conway, New Hampshire that I couldn't find again because I was there 7 years ago. I've just been drifting into comic book shops, and occasionally I'm just, I'll look at the periodicals rack at a Barnes & Noble, and they'll have a few comics out, and see something and go, oh, that looks fun. And so I have just been picking up comics. So for me, it's almost been like being a kid again and walking over to Cornelia Pharmacy in Cornelia, Georgia, and seeing what's on the spinner rack. And of course, the worst then was, oh wait, that's his Teen Titans number, 92. I must have missed 91. And then you couldn't find it, and now it's easy to find if you miss something.
Yeah, so. That's a great, that might be a way to invigorate the, get the excitement, because I miss finding comics now, because I've gone through previews, I've probably pre-ordered it, I've looked at it 2 or 3 times. I don't read a lot of extra comic stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things I wish someone would dump on my lap, like a good serious comic discussion site where that I could go to where people really talk like treat it like art.
You could start one.
There you go.
It's true. You're right. I'm sure it's out there, but but like I'm too lazy to go look for it, or I haven't really kind of searched it out. Maybe one of these days.
Yeah.
But that excitement would be a lot of fun. I can see how that would really be cool. I kind of like I every now and then I go to record stores. I'm a huge music geek, but I don't collect albums specifically, so that I can every now and then find a record store in a town and go in and be like, oh, this is so cool. I didn't even think, I forgot that this existed, that I read about this and hadn't found it,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I must say, I've really enjoyed speaking with both of you, and I appreciate all of the insight and guidance that you brought to the table. Is there anything else that either of you would like to say?
And thank you for having me. Again, it's been great, dude. You're this. I'm so glad that you keep doing this. You say you don't have that stoke. You don't have that excitement, but I think you nailed it earlier with saying that this is where you find that stoke. Yeah. This is where you get that excitement from. I bet that gearing up for each episode, you're kind of you get yourself jazzed when you send us the notes, this week, right? Then you got that little fire in the belly, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
See, that was pretty. You're pretty extensive. So right on, man. It's good stuff. Keep it up.
Thank you. Same. Thanks. I got nothing to add except thank you for doing this. I didn't know the podcast existed until you contacted me back in April or May, right before I was about to leave, and say, would you be interested in doing this? So two of the great discoveries for me on this whole field over back in the spring was discovering your podcast and discovering NPR's Pop Culture Happy Hour, which also covers comic books and things like that from time to time. And honestly, I've subscribed to intellectual podcasts, but these are the two I've actually really, really enjoyed listening to over the summer. It was a great part of my little summer sabbatical.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I appreciate it, and I thank you both for being here. I suppose maybe I would just offer these parting thoughts. So, in the end here, what makes a collector? I don't know that it's any one thing. We all seem to collect different things and collect in different ways. So some of us are completists and others are more casual. Some of us take our toys out of the box and display them. Others keep them sealed and out of sight. Some of our fathers share their stuff with their kids, and others keep them locked away. So we all collect in different ways, and I think the why of the collecting is different too. There are a lot of reasons, a lot of factors that drive us. So sometimes it's pure enjoyment. We love these characters. We want to follow their adventures. Sometimes maybe it's the habit and the routine. There's perhaps maybe a little bit of a speculator in each of us where we are keeping our eye on the value of these things and looking ahead to potentially selling them one day. I think pride and a sense of ownership is a big piece of it as well, feeling like you own a piece of these characters and their history. And also just having a tangible representation of all of these things. I think the thrill of the hunt is important too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big factor. Yeah. And certainly with art and with statues and even toys, they're decoration. They're again that visual representation of our fandom. So we collect different things and we collect them in different ways. If there's one thing that unites us and connects us, I think it's passion. And if you have that passion now, embrace it and relish it, because you might not always have it. But if you do find that you lose that fire, you might be able to get it back and experience a rebirth, even if it's a different kind of rebirth than you were expecting. This is Season 2 of My Comic Shop History, and I have been your host, Anthony Desiato. Thank you for listening, and as always, don't be a flat squirrel.